there's a deep contradiction, I think, within the MAGA coalition between the kind of Trump side on the one side, Trump, Mirren and the rest, and on the other side, the sort of Peter Thiel, Elon Musk wing, who are much more relaxed about trade. It's like a more realistic one. Is this going to cost you between $2,500 and $3,000 for an iPhone?
The majority of Trump voters, these are not their people they see as enemies necessarily.
I don't agree with that.
They're just not interested in that.
No, I disagree with that. Wall Street, the financial sector, is the enemy.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here. Today I'm joined by our Senior Education Fellow, Dr. Steve Davies, and our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz. One topic on the agenda today, it's Trump's tariffs yet again, I'm afraid. But today we're going to be asking about the broader question of political realignment and globalisation. So, Steve, the UK Prime Minister said last week, globalisation is dead. Do you agree?
I fear that he is right, yes. Certainly, if Donald Trump and the MAGA movement in the United States have their way, it will be. And I think that given they're in power and will be in unchecked power until at least the midterms and probably longer than that, then I think, yes, we are looking at that. Because if you look at the new kind of right that has grown out of the political realignment I've spoken about here and elsewhere many times, one of its central doctrines, if you will, or arguments, is that you need to move away from a free trade world of global capital flows, global integration, offshoring, all the rest of it, and move back towards a policy of economic nationalism. And in the American context, Trump has always favoured tariffs, partly because he has these bizarre ideas about what trade is, in which apparently selling goods to Americans in exchange for dollars is apparently exploiting them, which is a new take on that concept for me. But in addition to him, there is this whole political movement which thinks that the way to go is to restore American manufacturing, to reshore production, as they call it, to move the United States away from a situation in which it is essentially exporting dollars to the rest of the world in exchange for the rest of the world supplying it with a whole range of manufactured goods and other kinds of services. And the kind of steps that will be necessary for that to happen, that sort of political project to be realised, are not compatible with globalisation, particularly given the United States' central role in the way the world trade system currently works. So I fear Keir Starmer is right. I think that given the course American politics has taken and is likely to continue to take for some time, I think that we probably are looking at a world in which the latest episode of globalisation has come to an end.
But how did we get here? Because sitting here in London for the past 25 years or so, it doesn't seem like America's done that badly from the globalisation system.
Well, it depends who you are in America. This is one of the problems with the existing system. In one sense, everybody is better off. But, the gains from the increase in well-being have not been shared out evenly. Some people have benefited much more than others. In the American context, what that means is that if you are living in a globally connected metropolitan area, New York City, Southern California, the Bay Area, Metro Atlanta, Chicago, you're doing very, very nicely. If, on the other hand, you are living in one of the former industrial areas, you're living in Detroit or Mahoning Valley or Lehigh Valley, things have not been so good. You've maybe got cheaper products, you've got a better standard of living in that sense, but on the other hand, the kind of stable, high-paid employment that you used to have has gone, and you're left with a much more insecure, often fragile kind of employment. So the benefits have not been shared out equally, and more importantly, in some ways, there is a perception that there are severe social costs for some people to this process. So a lot of the complaints are not so much about being economically worse off, although you do get a lot of that. It's the argument that what this process of globalization has done is to destroy a way of life, an associated kind of masculinity, the idea of the male worker who can sustain his family, for example. It's destroyed a particular kind of purpose or meaningfulness to life, which has led, it's said, to that destruction, that is, to the so-called deaths of despair that Angus Dayton talks about in his more recent books. And so that's what has driven this kind of political backlash against globalization that we can see with Donald Trump, with the MAGA movement in the United States, and indeed elsewhere. In France, for example, with the support for Marine Le Pen in the deindustrialized northeast of France, or for the AfD in parts of the Ruhr and former East Germany.
So it manifests itself in a blend of economic and cultural disquiet, if you like. It's both of those things together, and they get mixed up.
Yes, precisely. And the idea is, which is very politically seductive, that if you want to address both these social and cultural things that you're unhappy about and also make people better off, the way to do it is to pull back from this global integration and to move back to a situation where the bulk of cars consumed by Americans are made in the United States, with parts made in the United States. And by extension, the same would be true for a whole range of other products. Now, I think what Trump is finding out, and what his people around him are finding out, is that that's actually far more difficult than they initially thought. Hence all this current tergiversation about whether or not it applies to smartphones, for example.
Mm-hmm. So that could be my next question, and I'll bring Kristian in here. Kristian, how much do you agree with this, and how much do you think it's permanent versus a flash in the pan that will be reversed once they've realised it's actually a bit too difficult and it's not going to work?
Well, normally I'm the pessimist here, but I think it's far too early to say that globalization is over. I'd say this is reading far too much consistency into a project which isn't that consistent. So if we're just talking about Trump himself, Trump the man, then yes, what we see now is perfectly consistent, because there is a video from him from, I think, 1988 or so, where if you watch it with the benefit of hindsight, you can almost see the tariff formulas in that short clip, because he goes on about a trade deficit with Japan, and he says it's impossible to sell things there. But he doesn't identify any actual barrier. He doesn't say, well, what exactly is the problem if you want to sell stuff in Japan? It's just somehow that he's tried it and it didn't work. So therefore, there must be, Japan must somehow be illegitimately keep out American goods and services. And that is basically what his formula, his tariff formula does. It just assumes that whenever there is a trade deficit, some country must be doing something illegitimate to keep out American goods. And even though he can't say what it is, and he can't, his argument in that 1988 clip wasn't that the Japanese are imposing tariffs on America, or that they're keeping the yen undervalued, or anything of that sort. It's really just, he just asserts you can't sell there, and that's it. Discussion over. And in that sense, you could say, okay, straight from the 1987 or 88 clip to the 2025 tariff formula, straight line, perfect consistency. But then again, Trumpism as a political project, electoral project, is it's far more driven by cultural concerns than by economic ones. And I think, Steve, this follows perfectly from your own realignment thesis. You're saying in your book that nowadays we form political camps, coalitions, not so much on the basis of are you a small state or a large state, a big government kind of guy, but more where do you stand on matters of culture or identity, that you have the nationalism versus cosmopolitanism, but also something else mixed up with that. So I remember reading somewhere that a few years ago that the best predictor of whether somebody is a Trump voter or not is whether or not they're fans of the World Wrestling Federation. Or it's called something else now. But it was called the World Wrestling Federation when I used to watch it as a kid in the early 90s. And it makes perfect sense to me, because it's outrageously Trumpian, right? It's in World Wrestling Federation, the baddie is usually foreign, and the good guys are usually American, and it's often some foreigner who comes, often some fake foreigner who just fakes a foreign accent and insults America, and then the good guy body slams him. So it's that kind of. So I didn't even understand it at the time with my school English, but at least with the benefit of hindsight, you can say, well, yeah, this is Trumpism, this is an early version of it, but it is purely cultural, and trade doesn't necessarily fit into it at all. And you could very easily imagine a version of Trumpism which isn't pro-free trade actively, but which is just indifferent to that. So if you imagine Trump, say, deciding that he doesn't want to run a second time, nominate some successor, some culture warrior who just doesn't have strong views on trade either way. I think that would be perfectly viable, and you could very easily imagine a post-Trump Republican, the movement after him, not going back to Reaganomics, not becoming, not moving into a direction that we would like to see, but just agnostic on free trade and just focusing on completely different things.
I'm afraid I am the pessimist in this conversation. As Kristian says, this is a reverse of roles, really. I think I agree, obviously, completely with what Kristian says, that this is not something where the economics is primary. It's the cultural division and it's the nationalism as opposed to globalism that is really driving this. The point is that support for nationalism, particularly in the United States context, then has downstream consequences for the kind of economic policy that people want to see put in place. And it's important to realize that this is not just Trump. Trump has, as Kristian says, his own rather bizarre and strange view of trade, which is that it's a zero-sum game. But around him, there's other people like his chief economic advisor, Stephen Davies, who have a much more kind of worked-out neo-mercantilist economic philosophy, if you will, and a take on the current position of the United States, a diagnosis, if you will, of what has produced the social pathologies that they are worried about, which requires certain kind of economic actions to deal with it. So although the culture is primary, it generates a particular kind of economic agenda. And I just don't see that shifting or changing, not least because the man who is most likely to replace Trump as the Republican nominee and maybe as president, the vice president, J.D. Vance, is much more firmly committed to this kind of larger theoretical project. So I do think we're going to see more of this. And it's basically, this is a kind of vision of the world in which there are good guys and bad guys, and good ways of making a living and bad ways of making a living. And the good way of making a living is basically working in manufacturing industry. This is the theory. Maybe agriculture, a few other things. What are the ways of making a living that are deprecated, if you will, seen as being somehow associated with the cultural pathologies that the MAGA people are up in arms with? Well, basically it's working in finance. It's working in globally traded sectors like finance, tech, IT, things of that sort, which partly explains why there's been this huge row this week between Trump's trade advisor and Elon Musk, with all kinds of really quite ripe and tasty insults flying back and forth, because there's a deep contradiction, I think, within the MAGA coalition between the kind of Trump side on the one side, Trump, Mirren and the rest, and on the other side, the sort of Peter Thiel, Elon Musk wing, who are much more relaxed about trade and other things like immigration than are the Trump camp. The other thing, of course, is that there's a geopolitical aspect to all this, which is that even if we do get a major pullback from the kind of initial rollout of tariffs across the board. And my own view is that they're going to have another go at doing this. I think they're realizing that their initial rollout was just too, A, over the top, and B, too general. But I think they are going to come back with a kind of more targeted version of it. It's pretty clear that the main target is China and that this has a geopolitical motive, not primarily, I think, an economic one. And that means that what you're talking about here is geopolitical competition between an established great power and a rising power. And we just have to really pray and hope that this, doesn't get beyond a trade war, because this is the kind of nonsense that can historically lead to shooting wars. So that's really what we should be worrying about. But when the world's largest manufacturing power and the world's largest consumer market are both at odds with each other and putting up, quite frankly, insane levels of tariff barrier against each other, it's hard to see how the system can go. And it's hard to see which party is going to give, because it's no longer about economics. It's about relative great power status. And that's a very intractable kind of conflict.
Will the economic reality kick in at some point? If they do double down, they're already, Trump's already, he's put the 90-day polls on. He's carving out iPhones and things from the Chinese tariffs. But so at some point, will the economic reality not hit, and will they not be forced to retreat back because suddenly it is about the economic?
Well, you would think so. I mean, this is the hope, and certainly I hope this is what happens, that the American consumer goes into Walmart and suddenly realizes all the products they've been buying have rocketed up in price. And there have been all kinds of estimates now about how much an iPhone is going to cost now, because of it's basically made entirely in China with Chinese parts. I have heard quotes as high as $10,000. Like a more realistic one is it's going to cost you between $2,500 to $3,000 for an iPhone. So hopefully when the American consumer is hit with all this kind of thing, they will, vote the Republicans out of Congress and give a big Democratic majority. And the Democrats will then, we hope, rediscover their free trade heritage. Historically, they were the free trade party. However, the reason why I'm not going to say straightforwardly, economic rationality is going to reassert itself, is that, to go back to my original point, we are in a world where economics is not the primary factor for a lot of voters. A lot of American voters now are of the mind, well, okay, this is going to hurt, but it's necessary to suffer the economic pain in order to make America great again. It's like the Brexit referendum, where the Remain case was all about the economic costs of leaving. And what I think that did not realise was that for many Leave voters, they knew they were going to be worse off economically, but they thought it was worth it because there were other non-political goods non-economic goods, I should say, that they valued more highly. And I think that's the problem. There will undoubtedly be reaction against it on the part of marginal voters, but I think the core constituency is going to just take it on the chin.
But there's a difference here. So in the case of Leave voters, a lot of it was driven by, they felt belittled by what they saw as a metropolitan Remain Europhile establishment, and they wanted to lash out against them to show them, okay, but we are the majority here, and we will get our way, and if that means the country is poorer, so be it. Whereas in the case of Trumpism, to the extent that it was a backlash against, say, the BLM protests of 4 or 5 years ago, and the progressive dominance of academia, well, these are not the people you can own with a tariff policy. So here your main opponent is going to be, say, old school Republicans, Reaganites, and the tech bros, the Elon Musks.
Indeed.
And for the majority of Trump voters, these are not their people they see as enemies necessarily.
I don't agree with that.
They're just not interested in that.
No, I disagree with that. I think that for a lot of the Trump voters in the kind of key constituencies that he's built his electoral success on, Wall Street, the financial sector, is the enemy. They see, for one thing, partly because of the way so many major American corporations went seriously woke in the last few years, there's an increasing kind of grassroots Republican feeling that big business is as much the enemy as the big universities and the progressives. But in particular, they do not like Wall Street and the financial services sector. And they're also very hostile to tech. So that's why it was rather ironic that you had all these tech bros sat on, a row on a bench at Trump's inauguration, because as far as a large part of the grassroots that have propelled him into office this time is concerned, those guys are in the frame just as much as the people at Columbia or Harvard are. So I don't agree with that, I'm afraid. They do see this as owning the enemy class because they see Wall Street as part of the coalition they don't like. And there's a long tradition of this in the United States, of course. This is the two big targets of populist politics in the United States for a very, very long time have been foreigners and the financial services sector. Used to be railroads as well, but of course nobody cares about them now.
There's a slight, just to go back to the economic reality kicking in point, there's a slight difference between the Brexit analogy and this is in that people will be, by the end of Trump's first term, people will be feeling the effects of these policies and may say at that point, hang on, this isn't working for me. Whereas with Brexit, it was, well, hypothetically, it may hurt us, but it will probably hurt the Libs more. So and it's sort of, and it's all a bit future and hypothetical. Whereas, I mean, arguably, the part of the Trump result in 2024 was because Biden didn't control inflation and all those other economic points.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the thing is, the big question here is not just what happens with Trump and the Republicans, it's what do the Democrats do? Because if the Democrats get their act together and come up with a kind of coherent policy that placates sufficiently enough of the angry Trump voters in places like the Mahoning Valley, and at the same time makes a principled case for a free trade open world, then we're looking at a much better place. The trouble is, I have no confidence, I'm afraid, that they will do that. That party is all over the place at the moment. They don't seem to know what they want to do. As somebody rather unkindly but accurately said, they're just waiting for their current leadership to die, which is, not a very good place to be in. And the other thing, which is part of all this, which adds to my sort of like pessimism, is that the role the United States has had at the moment in the global economic system is that basically they import colossal amounts of capital, because the flip side of the huge trade deficit they're running, of course, is an equally large capital account surplus. So what happens is essentially they give all the rest of the world large amounts of bits of green paper with pictures of dead presidents on them in exchange for physical goods, which is a really sweet deal. And then those people use those bits of green paper to trade amongst themselves, which is the function of the dollar as the international trading currency. But ultimately what they do is they send them back to the US. They buy US assets with them. Above all, they buy US sovereign debt. Now, in other words, the only reason why the Americans can run a whatever it is, $1.2 trillion deficit, deficit, is because they're importing capital from the rest of the world. Now, what Trump and Mirren seem to think they can do is to get rid of the trade surplus, but still keep the dollar as trade deficit, the Americans, I'm sorry, and still keep the dollar as the world's reserve currency. But that is like wanting to have your cake and eat it, basically. Not going to happen. If they do succeed in getting rid of the American trade deficit, that means there won't be all that capital coming back into the United States, which then will face them with some very difficult choices about how they fund the budget they've got. Now, the more smart people in the MAGA camp actually know this, and they think, well, we don't want to be running the world's reserve currency anymore. It's not acting in our interests anymore because it's hollowing out our industrial base. But if the Americans stop issuing a currency which performs a vital function in the way the world economy works, what will happen? Because you can't simply replace it. The Chinese are not going to suddenly take over that role. And so we're going to probably go back to the situation we had in the 1930s, where we didn't have an international reserve currency. It had been the pound before World War I, basically, but plus gold, of course. But from 1918, 19 through to 1944, 48, we didn't have an international reserve money. And that may well be what we're going to go back to.
Kristian, have you got an optimistic take on that for us, or do we have to end on the pessimism?
No, I mean, I would just say if we go back to the first Trump term, there were surveys on what motivated people to vote the way they did, and economics barely came up at all. So it's not that they thought he's going to bring back my manufacturing job even, or he's going to make me rich, but it was really about a feeling, this man understands me, this man speaks my language. And if it really is a kind of cultural attachment with only a very vague economics, then, okay, the combination of cultural Trumpism with economic nationalism is coherent. That's why I don't want to go too optimistic either, because it can persist. It is a coherent combination. But it's just, this is a vibes-based movement which doesn't care about consistency in the way we do. And if a Trump successor combines it with a more agnostic take on trade, then that could equally work.
So hypothetical 4-year term ends. Trump doesn't try and win for a third term. People have seen and felt the effects of tariffs. The new Republican leader comes in who's basically Trump, but is much more agnostic towards the tariffs. And you think that could work and be Trump MAGA continuity, just without
absolutely work,
without the trade war.
Yeah, that could work, but I would bet against it. Is my view. Simply because I think the genie, if you like, is out of the bottle. And I think that the kind of ructions and fallout from this initial attempt to get the project started are going to severely disrupt the world as we know it. For one thing, people are not going to trust the United States in the way that they did. A lot of people now are going to think, we just can't rely on these guys. And that's going to lead all kinds of governments all over the world on purely pragmatic grounds to change the way they behave and the things they do. So I'm afraid this may well be true, and it may well we have a more pragmatic approach towards trade policy. But I think that unless the Democrats can come up with the kind of principled case for cosmopolitanism and make that case at the next general, and Trump is not going to run again. The Constitution is very clear about that, so he isn't going to run it for a third term. Then I think we're still going to have an argument then between a more full-on nationalism from the Republicans and a kind of qualified, maybe a bit of nationalism around the edges, a bit more free trade stuff here from the Democrats. And so I think the long-term thrust at the moment of policy is away from the commitment to a globalized world.
And just to end, what hope is there for classical liberals? in this rather bleak future?
We have to basically keep on making the case. And one of the good things about this for classical liberals is, I think Kristian captured this in a tweet he put out, which is that we are suddenly the midwit normie opinion on this. So all kinds of people who seem to think you could impose taxes without any kind of side effects, for example, are suddenly saying, oh my God, these tariffs are a tax, they're going to destroy economic activity. Well, yes. Have you not thought about extending this analysis? And I think that, but seriously, what is revealing about this is that all of the sort of people who in their younger days were out there in Seattle with the Black Bloc protesting against the World Trade Organization have suddenly discovered that they're kind of quantum allies in the Pat Buchanan wing of the Republican Party who've got control of the US, and they don't like it. And I think that actually that we can form some quite surprising alliances on a number of fronts through that.
Yes, I don't think those people will learn. So it's not that the people from the original anti-globalization movement are going to say, oh, now we got what we wanted, but the wrong guy is implementing it. They're going to say these are not real tariffs. These are capitalist tariffs, and we want democratic, socialist people's tariffs. So I have zero hope that we're going to win over those people. But it is really, so I've seen people on the sensible centrist side who have never say anything about tariffs or trade before, are now up in arms against it because it's Trump doing it. And isn't it great? Now we are on the side of the sensibles. Hopefully this is going to make tariffs horrendously low status, and for once we're the good guys.
Brilliant. Well, that's a lovely note to end on. If you want to hear more from the new centrist dads here at the IEA, then tune in next time on our YouTube channel and follow us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. And until next time, thank you very much.